There exists a threshold between the known and the unknowable, a boundary as fragile as spider's silk, yet as absolute as the horizon line between earth and sky. In the ancient deserts of North Africa, in the sprawling dunes that stretch endlessly beneath unforgiving suns, and in the lush oases that puncture those golden wastes, this veil grows perilously thin. It is here, in these liminal spaces, where civilization surrenders to wilderness and day surrenders to night, that the truly dangerous things dwell. Beings that have haunted human consciousness for millennia, woven into the very fabric of Arab and Berber folklore with a persistence that defies rational explanation. These are the Selat, female Djinn, whose beauty is a weapon, whose seduction is a form of predation, and whose very existence challenges everything we believe about the nature of desire and death. Imagine, if you will, a traveler crossing the desert during the hours between dusk and full darkness, that vulnerable window when the world transitions from one state of being to another. The stars have begun their emergence, yet the sun's warmth still lingers on the sand beneath your feet. The air carries the scent of dried earth and something else, something you cannot quite name, a perfume that seems to transcend the ordinary world, that speaks to something ancient and primal within your consciousness. As the temperature drops and the isolation deepens, you notice that the usual sounds of evening have ceased. The birds have fled. The insects have fallen silent. There is only your breathing, your footsteps, and a profound emptiness that seems to possess intelligence and intent. This is the moment when the Selat emerge, slipping through the spaces between heartbeats, between thoughts, between the person you were and the person you are about to become. The Selat are not mere spirits or simple ghosts. They are sophisticated predators who have refined their hunting strategies across centuries of human encounter. They are Djinn, supernatural beings born from smokeless fire, according to Islamic and pre-Islamic Arabian tradition, entities of intelligence and malevolent purpose who inhabit dimensions adjacent to our own. Unlike demons of European folklore that operate through crude violence and obvious malevolence, the Selat employ subtlety, intellect, and a profound understanding of human psychology. They do not break down doors, they wait for you to open them. They do not force their will upon you. They make you believe you are choosing them of your own accord. This distinction is crucial to understanding why these creatures have survived in human memory for so long, why they continue to inspire fear and fascination across the contemporary Arab and North African world. They represent something far more terrifying than simple evil. They represent the corruption of desire itself. The legends of the Selat are woven deep into the cultural and spiritual consciousness of the Arab world and the Berber peoples of North Africa. These stories appear in manuscripts centuries old, whispered in villages as cautionary tales shared between generations, preserved in oral traditions that predate written language itself. They surface in the classical texts of Islamic scholars who attempted to categorize and explain them within theological frameworks, and they persist in the narratives found within the 1001 Nights, that monumental collection of stories that has introduced Middle Eastern folklore to the wider world. Each telling, each regional variation, each family's particular understanding of these creatures reveals something fundamental about how these cultures have understood the relationship between the masculine and the feminine, between attraction and annihilation, between the visible world and the supernatural realms that press against its boundaries. What makes the Selat particularly significant is not merely that they exist within folklore. Countless cultures possess legends of seductive supernatural entities, but rather the specific form they take and the cultural anxieties they embody. They are not abstractions or purely symbolic creatures. They are described with remarkable specificity across multiple sources and communities. Traveler accounts, religious scholarly discussions, and folk narratives converge in describing beings of extraordinary beauty, creatures whose physical forms display inhuman perfection that exceeds the boundaries of what biology permits. Yet this overwhelming beauty masks something wholly other, something that cannot be contained within human categories. The Seelat occupy a unique position within the broader landscape of world folklore because they crystallize distinctly Arab and Berber understandings of power, femininity, desire, and the supernatural in ways that their European counterparts, the succubi and the sirens, do not fully replicate. They are uniquely of their context, shaped by desert geography, by Islamic theology, by Berber spiritual traditions, and by the particular vulnerabilities of men traversing dangerous lands. Before we journey deeper into the nature of these entities, into the mechanics of their seduction, and the specific methods by which they drain the vital force from their victims, I want to create a space for your own voice in this exploration. Echoes of the Old World exists because we believe that understanding our global heritage, the stories that have shaped cultures, the myths that have guided civilizations, enriches us all. If you're finding this exploration fascinating, I deeply encourage you to join our community by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these carefully researched narratives to you, and it connects you to others who share your fascination with the profound depths of human mythology. Beyond that, I'd genuinely love to know, where are you watching this from? What drew you to the story of the Seelat? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and your engagement helps us understand what aspects of world folklore resonate most deeply with our audience. The Seelat endure in contemporary consciousness for a reason that transcends mere historical curiosity. They endure because they speak to something timeless within human experience, the terror of being unmade by attraction, the vulnerability of desire, the knowledge that the most dangerous predators often wear the faces of our deepest longings. They endure because they were born from real dangers, the perils of desert travel, the psychological toll of isolation, the genuine hazards faced by those traversing regions, where the margins between survival and oblivion were razor thin. Over the centuries, these dangers transformed into entities, into supernatural explanations for inexplicable tragedies, into cautionary figures that parents invoke to protect their children from risky behavior. The Seelat are folklore, yes, but they are folklore shaped by necessity, by genuine human vulnerability, and by the profound need to understand and categorize the forces, both internal and external, that threaten our existence. As we move forward through this exploration, keep this truth at the forefront of your mind. Every detail we examine, every characteristic we scrutinize, every protection we discover reveals something profound, not just about these supernatural beings, but about the cultures that birthed them and the universal human fear of being seduced toward oblivion. The first thing you must understand about the Seelat is that their greatest weapon is not magic, nor supernatural force, nor any power that reveals itself through obvious signs. Their most lethal tool is their beauty, a beauty that exceeds the boundaries of human possibility, that transcends the ordinary spectrum of feminine attractiveness, and enters into something altogether different, something that awakens in observers an almost religious fervor of desire. This is not the beauty of a particularly striking woman encountered in a marketplace or admired from across a room. This is beauty so absolute, so perfectly calibrated to every aesthetic yearning harbored in the male consciousness, that it functions almost as a form of supernatural compulsion. Those who have encountered it in historical accounts or in oral traditions, often describe it using language that hovers between admiration and terror, as though they struggle to reconcile the pleasure of beholding such forms with the dread of understanding what they truly were. Imagine, if you will, a woman emerging from the heat shimmer of the desert horizon at sunset. Her form materializes gradually, becoming more defined as she approaches. A silhouette that seems to possess an impossible perfection, a symmetry that no earthly woman could naturally possess. Her face is a study in inhuman proportion, eyes too large, too luminous, holding depths that seem to contain entire universes of knowledge and seduction. The color of these eyes shifts depending on the angle of the light and the observer's state of mind, sometimes appearing as molten amber, sometimes as deep emerald, sometimes as something that has no name in human language. Her skin possesses a luminescence that suggests it radiates light rather than merely reflecting it, as though she has swallowed starlight and now allows it to emanate through her pores. Her hair cascades in waves that never quite settle, as though perpetually moving through an invisible wind that affects only her, creating a constant aura of motion and fluidity around her form. The features that mark a Sila as distinctly other are not distributed evenly across her form. Some are immediately obvious to the observer, while others remain hidden, concealed through careful manipulation of clothing, posture, and misdirection. Her face, her hands, her neck, and her upper body are crafted with such deliberate perfection that they exceed human parameters of beauty and instead enter into something approaching the divine. She moves with a grace that suggests her body operates under different physical laws than those governing ordinary matter. Each gesture economical yet flowing, each movement suggesting both control and an almost serpentine fluidity. When she speaks, her voice carries harmonics that human vocal cords cannot naturally produce, a melodic quality that seems to bypass the ears and speak directly to some primitive part of the brain that predates language. This voice, combined with her physical form, creates a synesthetic experience in observers. They hear beauty as though it were a taste. They see her movements as though they were touching them. Their senses merge and blur until the boundary between observer and observed begins to dissolve. What makes the Sila particularly effective as predators is that their beauty is not static or uniform. Rather, it appears to adjust itself to the specific vulnerabilities and desires of each individual observer. One man might see in her the face of a beloved he lost years ago. Another might perceive in her the idealized form he has secretly craved his entire life. A third might encounter in her presence the embodiment of every fantasy his conscious mind would never permit itself to acknowledge. This adaptive quality of their appearance is not achieved through illusion in the traditional sense. They do not cast false images or trick the eye into perceiving something that is not there. Rather, they seem to possess an intuitive understanding of human psychology so profound that they can present the authentic truth of their being in a manner that each observer interprets as the precise manifestation of his deepest desires. The Sila is simultaneously all women and no woman, specific and undefined, utterly real and impossible. Beneath this perfect exterior, however, lies a profound duality that marks the absolute boundary between the Sila and ordinary human femininity. The beauty that adorns their faces and bodies is real, but it is real in the way that a perfectly constructed trap is real. It exists, but its existence serves a singular purpose. Beneath the luminous skin and the proportioned features lies a form that exists partially outside human dimensional space. A body that can compress and expand according to supernatural necessity, that can shift its mass and configuration in ways that violate the laws governing human anatomy. This hidden aspect of their nature remains concealed during the seduction phase, precisely because revelation of their true form would shatter the spell they weave. The Seelat must remain beautiful, must remain the idealized woman, must continue to embody the fantasy, because the moment her victims glimpse what lies beneath the cosmetic perfection of her appearance, the moment they catch even a partial view of her true nature, the predatory relationship transforms into something far more dangerous and far more final. The contrast between the Seelat's human disguise and her actual nature cannot be overstated. During the phase of seduction, she exists primarily in the mode of presentation. Her beauty, a carefully maintained facade that requires constant attention and psychological reinforcement. She dresses in garments that emphasize her desirability while strategically concealing the physical markers that would expose her identity. She positions her hands and feet in ways that prevent casual observation of their true nature. She maintains a careful distance that allows her to control the quality of light falling upon her, the angles from which she can be observed, the circumstances under which verification of her humanity might occur. Every element of her presentation is calculated, intentional, and executed with the precision of a predator who has honed her craft across centuries of human encounter. This sustained performance demands considerable energy and focus from the seeker, but the rewards of successful seduction, the harvesting of vital force from her victim, far exceed the cost of maintaining her disguise. It is worth noting that the Seelat's beauty serves a second critical function beyond mere seduction. It renders their victims cognitively compromised. The human mind, when confronted with beauty approaching the supernatural, experiences something approaching neurological disruption. Rational thought becomes difficult. Skepticism dissolves. The victim finds himself willing to disbelieve obvious warning signs, to rationalize inconsistencies, to overlook small details that should trigger alarm. If a beautiful woman refuses to eat salt, if she seems to cast no shadow at certain hours, if her feet never quite touch the ground as she walks, the enchanted victim will construct elaborate explanations for these observations rather than acknowledge the simple truth staring him in the face. The beauty of the Seelat is thus not merely a tool of attraction, it is a tool of cognitive manipulation, a supernatural compulsion that prioritizes desire over reason and makes men accomplices in their own destruction. Beneath the cascading hair, below the luminous skin, hidden beneath carefully selected garments and strategic positioning, lies the single most defining characteristic of the Seelat, the feature that transforms them from idealized human women into something altogether other, something that cannot be dismissed or rationalized away once glimpsed. The Seelat possess cloven hooves instead of human feet, the hard divided appendages of goats or donkeys, creatures of burden and wildness, animals symbolizing both fertility and chaos throughout Mediterranean and Middle Eastern traditions. These hooves are not metaphorical or symbolic. They are physical realities, as solid and undeniable as bone and keratin, present on every sailor who walks this earth and the realms adjacent to it. They are the mark of her true nature, the anatomical evidence that places her outside the boundaries of human possibility, the singular detail that would immediately alert any observer to the predatory reality concealed beneath her beautiful exterior. Understanding these hooves, understanding why they appear with such consistency across centuries of testimony and across vast geographical territories, understanding how the Seelat managed to conceal them during the seduction phase, is essential to comprehending the full scope of these creatures' nature and the mechanisms through which they operate. The appearance of the hooves deserves careful examination because their specific form tells us something profound about the cultural understanding of what the Seelat represent. In the majority of historical accounts and oral traditions, the sealat's feet are described as cloven hooves, similar to those of a goat, a creature deeply embedded in both Islamic and pre-Islamic Arabian symbolism. The goat appears throughout Middle Eastern and North African folklore as a symbol of lasciviousness, of untamed sexuality, of wildness that resists domestication and civilization. In Islamic theological texts, the goat represents the unbridled animal nature that stands opposed to human reason and spiritual discipline. The choice of goat hooves for the sealat is therefore not arbitrary. It consciously links these seductive jinn to the very forces of uncontrolled desire and animal nature that they embody in their predatory behavior. Some accounts, however, particularly those from Berber traditions and certain regional variations of the legend, describe the hooves as belonging to a donkey, a creature symbolizing both labor and stupidity, the beast of burden, the animal forced to carry the weights that others refuse to shoulder. This variation suggests a slightly different cultural emphasis. The donkey's hoof marks not merely lasciviousness, but degradation, the reduction of the masculine victim to a beast of burden, subjugated and enslaved by forces beyond his comprehension. The hooves themselves are typically described as possessing a dark coloration, black or deep brown, sometimes with a reddish tint that suggests something less than fully terrestrial. They are hard and polished, suggesting a surface that would be cold to the touch, that would make distinctive sounds against stone or hard-packed earth. Unlike human feet, which are soft and vulnerable, requiring constant care and protection, the sealat's hooves are built for endurance, for traversing harsh terrain, for leaving marks that cannot be erased or cleaned away. This physical architecture marks them as creatures fundamentally suited to the desert environment, to the wild and untamed spaces where human civilization has not yet established dominion. The hooves are not feet that have evolved to carry a body through drawing rooms and marketplaces. They are appendages designed for the wilderness, for traversing sand and rock, for movement in spaces where human anatomy becomes a liability rather than an asset. In this physical detail lies a profound truth about the sealat. They are not truly of human civilization, no matter how perfectly their upper bodies might simulate humanity. They are creatures of the margins, of the wild spaces, wearing human disguise as a hunting strategy rather than as a genuine attempt at integration into human society. The concealment of the hooves represents one of the sealat's most crucial tactical necessities during the seduction phase. A woman with human feet can walk freely through any environment, can stand with her feet exposed without triggering suspicion, can wade through water or sand without fear of revelation. A woman with cloven hooves must engage in constant vigilance, must control every situation in ways that prevent her feet from becoming visible to her victim. This requirement shapes virtually every element of her behavior during the seduction process. She wears long garments that sweep the ground, ensuring that her feet remain concealed regardless of her posture or movement. She avoids situations where she might be expected to remove her shoes or where water might wet the hem of her clothing. She positions herself strategically on elevated surfaces, on cushions or carpets, ensuring that her feet never rest directly on the ground where their form might be observed. She walks only on certain surfaces, avoiding terrain where the distinctive clicking sound of hooves against stone might betray her identity. She manipulates circumstances such that her victim becomes so intoxicated with desire that observation of such practical details becomes impossible. The historical and folkloric record provides numerous accounts of moments when the concealment of the hooves failed, when a victim caught a glimpse of the truth beneath the beautiful exterior. In some traditions, these revelations occur during intimate moments, when the barriers of clothing are temporarily removed. In others, they happen through accident, a stumble that causes her to step in water, the displacement of a garment in wind, a moment of carelessness when her guard drops. The accounts consistently describe a profound moment of recognition in the victim's consciousness, a sudden shattering of the enchantment as the reality of what he has been seducing becomes undeniable. Some narratives suggest that this moment of revelation triggers an immediate and dramatic response from the sealer. She may abandon her disguise entirely, may cease her seduction and move toward direct predation, may flee into the desert with superhuman speed. Other accounts suggest a more sinister outcome. The victim, having glimpsed the truth, suddenly realizes he is trapped, that his life is forfeit, that he has already consumed of her power to such a degree that escape is no longer possible. The concealment of the hooves also reveals something important about the psychology of the sealat as predators. These creatures do not operate purely through supernatural compulsion or magical force. They operate through manipulation of human perception and human desire. By ensuring that their most obvious non-human feature remains concealed, they maintain the possibility of plausible deniability in the victim's mind. So long as the hooves remain hidden, the victim can maintain the fantasy that he's interacting with an extraordinary but ultimately human woman. Once the hooves are revealed, this possibility dissolves and the victim must confront the truth directly. The sealat understand human psychology intimately. They know that the human mind possesses remarkable capacity for denial and rationalization when confronted with evidence that contradicts deeply held desires. By maintaining the concealment of their hooves, they preserve this capacity for denial. They allow their victims to continue believing in the fiction even as the fiction destroys them. The sealat are not creatures of cities or settled civilizations, not beings who dwell comfortably within the structures and boundaries that humans have constructed to impose order upon the landscape. They are, instead, creatures of the desert and the oasis, liminal spaces that exist as thresholds between habitation and oblivion, between the known world and the spaces that remain fundamentally unmapped and unknowable. This geographical specificity is not arbitrary. It is foundational to understanding their nature, their power, and the mechanisms through which they operate as predators. The desert itself, with its vastness, its hostility to human life, and its capacity to isolate travelers from any semblance of community or rescue, creates the perfect hunting ground for entities whose survival depends upon the vulnerability and isolation of their victims. The oasis, with its position as a critical point of human passage and resource gathering, transforms into a dangerous trap where travelers must pause, must lower their guard, must surrender to the illusion of safety. Geography and predation are fundamentally intertwined in the nature of the sealat, and understanding one without the other is to misunderstand their entire operational framework. To comprehend the relationship between the sealat and the desert landscape, one must first understand the desert itself as more than mere geography. It is a living force, a space possessed of its own agency and intelligence. The deserts of North Africa, particularly those that stretch across the Sahara and through the territories of the Maghreb, have always existed at the edge of human consciousness as places of both promise and terror. They offer trade routes, they offer resources, they offer opportunities for movement and commerce. Simultaneously, they offer death through thirst, death through heat, death through the disorientation that comes from endless sameness and the loss of familiar landmarks. The human being in the desert exists in a state of profound vulnerability. The usual mechanisms of social support and institutional protection that govern human life in settled communities become meaningless. There is no one to call for help. There's no authority to appeal to. There is only the traveler, the landscape, and whatever forces inhabit that landscape. This vulnerability creates a perfect environment for the sealat, who understand and exploit the psychological fragility of those whose survival depends entirely upon their own resources and will. the Sealat's relationship with the desert is not that of a parasite dwelling in an environment hostile to its presence. Rather, they possess a symbiotic relationship with the desert itself, drawing power from its vastness, its aridity, its capacity to distort human perception and judgment. The heat of the day creates mirages that confuse and disorient travelers, making them question the evidence of their own senses and rendering them susceptible to the seductive illusions the Sealat project. The cold of the desert night transforms the environment into something utterly alien, strips away the familiarity of daylight, and makes travelers psychologically desperate for warmth and human companionship. The wind carries the scent of distant water and vegetation, drawing travelers forward in directions that may lead to salvation or to their destruction. In this environment of sensory distortion and psychological vulnerability, the Sealat flourish. They exist partially in the space of the physical landscape and partially in the space of human perception, occupying the gap between reality and hallucination, between the true and the imagined. The desert amplifies their power not through any obvious magical mechanism, but through the simple truth that a frightened, disoriented, thirsty human being becomes far more susceptible to seduction and far less capable of rational resistance. The oasis presents a different but equally significant hunting ground for the Sealat. An oasis is not merely a geographical feature. It is a crossing point, a place where the movements of human commerce and migration converge, where multiple travelers from different directions arrive within a compressed temporal and spatial framework. The oasis represents safety after days in the desert, offering water, shade, vegetation, and the possibility of human encounter and social interaction. These characteristics make the oasis an ideal location for the Sealat to hunt, because travelers arriving at an oasis are in a state of psychological vulnerability, combined with relief and gratitude. Their critical faculties, exhausted by days of exposure and deprivation, are at their lowest point precisely when encountering a beautiful woman at an oasis would seem not like a threat, but like a blessing, like a reward for having survived the ordeal of desert travel. The Sealat positioned at an oasis can select her victims from among the constant flow of travelers passing through, can study her targets before initiating contact, can disappear into the desert if a seduction goes wrong, or if a victim proves resistant to her charms. The oasis, therefore, functions as a deliberate hunting station, a position of strategic advantage where the Sealat can operate with maximum effectiveness and minimum risk of exposure. Certain oases across North Africa have acquired particular reputations in folklore and oral tradition as hotbeds of Sealat activity, places where the supernatural intrudes more obviously upon the ordinary world than in other locations. These oases tend to possess certain characteristics. They are positioned at major crossing points for merchants and travelers. They possess abundance of water and vegetation, and they have witnessed unusual numbers of disappearances or deaths among travelers. The locals in communities surrounding these oases develop elaborate traditions regarding their dangers. They warn visitors of the spiritual hazards present. They develop protective rituals and avoid certain locations during vulnerable hours. In many cases, these folklore traditions represent accumulated human experience over centuries, the collective wisdom of cultures that have learned through tragic repetition where danger lies and how to survive it. The reputation of such oases serves a crucial function. It causes some potential victims to avoid them entirely, thus concentrating the Sealat's hunting among those travelers most desperate, most willing to risk known danger in exchange for the promise of water and rest. The oasis becomes a filter, selecting for those victims most likely to fall prey to seduction through desperation. The power of the Sealat appears to fluctuate based on their proximity to and connection with these specific landscapes. Historical accounts and oral traditions suggest that a Sila grows more powerful the closer she remains to the desert and oasis environments that birthed her. That her abilities diminish if she ventures into settled communities or agricultural regions where human civilization has thoroughly transformed the landscape. This geographical restriction may relate to the fact that the Silat exist partially within the supernatural dimensions that inhabit the desert, dimensions that are less densely populated with human structures and institutions in such isolated environments. A Sila removed from the desert loses access to whatever supernatural resources or powers she draws from that landscape, and thus becomes more vulnerable to detection and more limited in her predatory capabilities. This restriction would explain why historical accounts of Silat encounters cluster overwhelmingly around desert and oasis environments, why there are relatively few accounts of Silat operating successfully in major urban centers, and why folklore traditions associate these creatures so specifically with wilderness areas rather than with civilization. The seduction practiced by the Silat is not a crude or obvious process, not a simple matter of a beautiful woman appearing and a man immediately abandoning reason in pursuit of her. Rather, it is an intricate, multi-layered manipulation that operates simultaneously on the conscious and unconscious levels of human psychology, that weaponizes desire itself and transforms it into a mechanism of predation. The Silat, who have hunted for centuries, have refined this process to an extraordinary degree of sophistication, understanding the vulnerabilities inherent in human masculine psychology with an intuition that exceeds the comprehension of modern psychology or behavioral science. They understand the precise sequence of psychological states that renders a man most susceptible to their influence. They know exactly which buttons to press and in what order. They possess knowledge accumulated across generations of predation that allows them to tailor their approach to individual vulnerabilities. The seduction of the Silat is not romance, it is warfare, conducted through the weaponization of desire, a calculated assault on human rationality, dressed in the language of attraction and passion. The first stage of Silat seduction begins long before conscious contact, in the domain of selection and observation. The Silat does not hunt indiscriminately. She selects her victims with deliberate care, identifying men who possess specific psychological vulnerabilities that make them susceptible to her particular form of predation. She observes travelers at oases and along trade routes, studying their behavior, assessing their psychological state, identifying which men carry within them the particular forms of isolation, loneliness, or desperation that render them most malleable to her influence. A man traveling alone, separated from community and social support structures, presents an ideal target. A man who has suffered romantic rejection or loss makes an even better candidate because he carries within him an active wound, a psychological vulnerability that the Silat can exploit directly. The man, at the absolute limit of his psychological endurance, exhausted, frightened, disoriented by desert travel, desperate for comfort, becomes the perfect victim because his critical faculties have been so thoroughly depleted that rational resistance becomes nearly impossible. The Silat spends days or even weeks observing her target before initiating contact, ensuring that she has correctly identified his vulnerabilities and calculated the precise approach that will prove most effective. Once a suitable victim has been identified and observed, the Silat initiates the second stage of her seduction, the staged encounter. This encounter never appears forced or manufactured. It always seems to occur by pure chance, as though the meeting of the Sila and her victim represents nothing more than fortunate circumstance. The victim, arriving at an oasis after days of brutal desert travel, notices a woman drawing water or resting beneath the shade of a palm tree. She appears surprised by his presence, perhaps even slightly apprehensive, presenting herself as vulnerable and in need of reassurance rather than as a threat or an aggressive seducer. This reversal of expected roles proves psychologically crucial. The victim experiences not predation, but the opportunity to be protector and provider, to exercise the masculine functions of protection and provision that his isolation has prevented him from fulfilling. The sealer allows the victim to approach her, to initiate conversation, to make himself believe that he is the active agent in this encounter, and that she is merely responding to his advances. In reality, every element of the staged encounter has been carefully orchestrated. Her position, her appearance, her apparent emotional state, the exact moment of his arrival, all have been calculated to produce maximum psychological impact. The third stage involves the cultivation of intimacy and trust through a series of carefully calibrated interactions. The sealer listens intently to the victim's stories, appearing to absorb every word with genuine interest and deep compassion. She mirrors his emotional state. She expresses sympathy for his suffering. She makes him feel truly seen and understood in ways that his isolation has prevented him from experiencing with other human beings. She shares carefully constructed false narratives about herself, stories designed to make her seem simultaneously exotic and vulnerable, simultaneously powerful and in need of his strength. She arranges circumstances such that the victim remains at the oasis longer than planned, finding reasons to extend his stay, becoming increasingly reluctant to depart. She may suggest that traveling during certain hours is dangerous, that they should wait for more favorable conditions, that his hasty departure would be foolish. She positions herself as the one person in the world who truly understands him, who accepts him completely, who offers the possibility of genuine connection in a world where such connection has been absent from his life. The fourth stage moves toward physical and energetic contact, the moment when the sealer transitions from psychological manipulation into direct supernatural predation. The sealer initiates physical contact, a touch on the arm, a brush of her hand against his, a moment of physical proximity that allows her to begin the actual process of drawing his vital force. At this stage, the victim no longer possesses the psychological resources to resist, no longer possesses the desire to resist, having been thoroughly conditioned to accept her presence as the greatest blessing that could befall him. The physical contact may appear innocent to outside observers, a hand held, a moment of closeness, an embrace that could be interpreted as comforting or affectionate. What is actually occurring is far more sinister. The sealer is actively drawing upon his life force, extracting the fundamental energy that animates his physical and spiritual existence. The victim experiences this process not as violation, but as pleasure, as an intensity of connection and sensation that exceeds anything he has previously experienced. His consciousness seems to expand. His perception becomes heightened. His sense of self dissolves into a state of ecstatic merger with the sealer. He cannot perceive that he is being consumed. He can only perceive that he is finally, after a lifetime of alienation, experiencing true connection. The psychological genius of sealer seduction lies in how completely it weaponizes the human need for intimacy and connection. The victim is not forced into submission. He actively cooperates in his own destruction, believing himself to be experiencing profound love and acceptance when he is actually being systematically drained of the energy that sustains his existence. The sealer understands that human beings are fundamentally social creatures, that isolation and loneliness represent profound forms of psychological torture, and that a lonely man will often willingly surrender himself to almost any force that promises to relieve that isolation. She exploits this understanding with ruthless precision, offering the victim the exact form of connection and validation that his psyche most desperately craves, knowing that this offer will render him incapable of rational resistance. The seduction is thus not merely a technique of predation. It is an exploitation of fundamental truths about human psychology, a weaponization of human need itself. The purpose of the Seelat's seduction, the ultimate goal toward which all her manipulation and psychological warfare is directed, is neither mere cruelty nor simple predation in the conventional sense. Rather, the Seelat hunts for something far more fundamental and far more terrible: the vital force, the essential energy that animates human existence, the spark that distinguishes the living from the dead. In Islamic and pre-Islamic Arabian mystical traditions, this vital force is understood as something distinct from the physical body itself, something that can be diminished, extracted, or consumed without necessarily destroying the physical organism immediately. A man can lose his vital force over extended periods and continue to exist in a degraded state, functioning physically while spiritually and psychologically hollowed out. A shell inhabited by consciousness, but devoid of the energy that makes life meaningful or worthwhile. The Seelat understands this truth intimately. She knows that the extraction of vital force is a process that can be prolonged, that can be savored, that transforms her victim into something between life and death. Something that can continue to provide sustenance long after conventional murder would have ceased to be possible. The mechanics of vital force extraction, as described in historical accounts and folklore traditions, involve a transfer of energy that occurs through sustained physical and emotional contact. When the Seela touches her victim, when she holds him close, when she permits him to engage in physical intimacy with her, she creates a channel through which his energy flows into her being. This transfer is not violent or obviously destructive in the moment. The victim experiences it as pleasure, as an intensity of sensation that seems to validate everything he has been promised through the seduction process. His heart rate increases, his breathing becomes rapid and shallow. His consciousness seems to expand beyond the boundaries of his individual self. He feels simultaneously more alive than he has ever been, and, paradoxically, gradually less capable of independent existence. The Seela, meanwhile, experiences a profound revitalization through this transfer, her beauty becoming even more luminous, her power expanding, her capacity for further predation multiplying. What appears to the victim as mutual passion and connection is actually a parasitic relationship in which one party is systematically consuming the other. The effects of prolonged vital force extraction upon the victim follow a recognizable pattern that appears consistently across historical accounts from widely separated geographical regions and time periods. In the early stages of the relationship, the victim experiences what might be characterized as increasing psychological dependency combined with physical vitality. He feels more energized than he has in years, more capable, more confident in his own existence. His mind becomes clearer in some respects. He can think with unusual intensity about his beloved, while simultaneously becoming clouded and impaired in others. He loses the ability to think about anything except the Seela. Other concerns that previously occupied his consciousness simply fade away. His appetite for food diminishes. He no longer requires sleep in the normal quantities. He becomes indifferent to the passage of time and to the outside world. These changes appear to him as positive transformations, as evidence that his life has finally acquired meaning and direction. In reality, his physical body is beginning to be depleted of the energy necessary for normal functioning. His biological systems beginning to enter into a state of gradual shutdown. As the relationship progresses and the Seelat continues her feeding, the victim enters into a second phase, characterized by visible physical decline, combined with intense psychological attachment. his appearance begins to change noticeably. He becomes thin, often gaunt, his skin taking on a greyish or ashen quality that seems to suggest that blood no longer flows through his veins with normal vitality. His eyes, which in the early stages of seduction appeared bright with passion and meaning, begin to take on a hollow quality, as though something essential behind them has been removed. He becomes increasingly disoriented, losing track of time, unable to remember simple details about his own life or identity. Yet, simultaneously, his emotional attachment to the Sitla intensifies beyond reason or rational comprehension. He would willingly abandon his family, his community, his own survival needs, for the possibility of spending additional moments in her presence. He experiences what might be characterized as a state of spiritual addiction, in which the mere presence of the Sialat becomes necessary for his continued psychological functioning. Without her, he experiences not merely sadness, but existential terror, a sense that he is dissolving into non-existence. The third and final phase of vital force extraction occurs when the victim has been so thoroughly depleted that he approaches the absolute limits of human endurance. At this stage, accounts diverge regarding the specific outcome. Some narratives suggest that the Salat, sensing that her victim has become nearly worthless as a source of sustenance, abandons him to die alone in the desert or other isolated location, leaving behind a corpse so desiccated and deteriorated that identification becomes impossible. Other traditions describe more dramatic conclusions, with the victim either being deliberately destroyed by the Silat once his utility has been exhausted, or with the victim dying during an intense moment of intimate contact, his final moments of consciousness characterized by a paradoxical sense of ecstatic union with his destroyer. Some folklore accounts suggest that the most powerful Silat do not completely drain their victims, but instead maintain them in a perpetual state of partial depletion, visiting them repeatedly over years or even decades, sustaining them just barely alive so that they continue to provide sustenance. These traditions describe men who become legendary figures in their communities, men known to be spiritually empty despite physical survival, men who live as cautionary tales of what happens to those seduced by forces beyond human comprehension. The extraction of vital force by the Silat should not be understood as a process that requires the victim's death, though death often results from repeated or intensive feeding. Rather, it is a process of systematic consumption that can persist indefinitely, so long as the victim continues to provide energy worth extracting. The Silat, as an intelligent predator, understands the principle that one should not completely exhaust one's hunting grounds. A victim can continue to be valuable even when severely depleted, even when reduced to something barely recognizable as human. This understanding explains the persistence of the Silat phenomenon across centuries. These creatures have learned through accumulated experience that sustainable predation requires maintaining at least a portion of the victim's will to live, maintaining enough psychological attachment that the victim continues to seek out the Silat's presence, even when he rationally comprehends that this presence is destroying him. The most enduring and widely recognized source of Silat narratives appears not in scholarly texts or religious treatises, but in the collection of stories known throughout the Arabic-speaking world as Alf Layla wa Layla, the 1001 Nights. These stories, compiled over centuries from various sources and refined through countless retellings, represent perhaps the most influential literary preservation of Silat mythology and related Djinn narratives available to contemporary audiences. The tales preserved within this monumental collection offer us windows into how medieval Arab consciousness understood these entities, how they positioned them within the broader cosmology of Islamic and pre-Islamic spirituality, and how they utilize these stories to transmit cultural warnings and wisdom across generations. Within the framework of Scheherazada's extended narrative to her husband the king, stories of seductive Djinn and dangerous supernatural entities function not merely as entertainment, but as elaborate moral instruction, each tale designed to illuminate some aspect of human vulnerability or spiritual danger that required explicit acknowledgement and careful consideration. One of the most significant narratives featuring entities closely related to the Silat appears in the story of Prince Kamar al-Zaman, a tale that explores themes of seduction, supernatural intervention, and the dangers posed by beings operating from the margins of human society. In this narrative, the prince encounters a figure of extraordinary beauty who approaches him during his travels, presenting herself as a human woman in need of protection and assistance. The prince, moved by her apparent vulnerability and overwhelming beauty, welcomes her into his confidence and permits her to accompany him through his journey. What unfolds is a complex exploration of how even the most educated and elite members of society can be rendered powerless by the seductive force of supernatural femininity, how intelligence and social status provide no protection against the predatory strategies employed by these entities. The narrative slowly reveals that the beautiful woman is not human, but a being of the supernatural realm, one who has deliberately approached the prince for purposes that become increasingly sinister as the story progresses. The tale exemplifies the classical structure through which Arab and Islamic narratives approach the Silat problem: the seduction, the gradual revelation of truth, and the ultimate resolution that restores social and spiritual order. Another crucial narrative appears in the story of the Three Princes of Serendip, a tale that contains within it subsidiary narratives of Djinn encounters and supernatural seduction. This story, with its complex nested structure of tales within tales, creates a framework through which multiple perspectives on supernatural danger can be presented simultaneously. The narrative emphasizes the importance of observation, of noting small details that appear inconsistent with human normalcy, of maintaining vigilance, even in moments of apparent safety. One of the princes encounters a woman of surpassing beauty who seems to embody every ideal of feminine virtue and desirability. However, through careful observation and disciplined skepticism, he notices details that betray her true nature. The way her feet never quite touch the ground, the manner in which she avoids consuming certain foods, the peculiar reflection of light in her eyes that suggests something non-human gazing back at him. The narrative structure demonstrates that recognition of supernatural threat requires both intuitive understanding and rational observation, that the victory over seductive Djinn depends not merely on spiritual purity, but also on the maintenance of critical awareness. The tale of Kamar al-Zaman and Budur presents yet another variation on Silat seduction themes, but one complicated by elements of reciprocal desire and the possibility of transformation through relationship. In this narrative, two beautiful individuals experience simultaneous supernatural visitations, each dreaming of the other across the barriers that normally separate lovers. The narrative explores whether supernatural beings can experience something approaching genuine emotion, whether desire can operate in domains beyond simple predation. Yet even as the story suggests the possibility of mutual affection between human and supernatural realms, it carefully demonstrates the profound dangers such crossing creates, the way that violation of natural boundaries produces suffering and tragedy that can only be resolved through elaborate magical intervention. The story suggests that while the Silat and related Djinn may possess intelligence and something approximating emotion, the fundamental asymmetry of power between human and supernatural being renders genuine mutuality impossible. Any relationship between them must inevitably resolve toward destruction or transformation of the human participant. The 1001 Nights contains numerous other narratives that reference or tangentially engage with Silat and seductive Djinn, each contributing to a rich and complex understanding of these creatures within classical Arab imagination. Stories of the merchant Sinbad, who encounters various supernatural beings during his voyages, include episodes featuring seductive entities who approach him with promises of companionship and sanctuary. The narrative structure typically follows a pattern. The supernatural being appears to offer what the protagonist most desperately desires: a temporary reprieve from suffering or danger, a promise of safety and comfort. Yet acceptance of this offer invariably leads to situations far more dangerous than those the protagonist initially faced. The repeated iteration of this narrative pattern across multiple stories suggests that classical Arab storytellers understood seduction by supernatural entities not as isolated incidents, but as a recurring hazard embedded within human existence, a danger that required constant awareness and vigilance to resist successfully. What distinguishes the Silat narratives within the 1001 Nights from other supernatural tales is their emphasis on the subjective experience of the victim. The narratives do not merely describe events from an external perspective. They attempt to render the internal psychological state of the protagonist as he experiences seduction, the intoxicating quality of the supernatural being's attention, the dissolution of rational resistance under the overwhelming intensity of desire and connection. This psychological realism, this attention to the victim's interior experience, suggests that the storytellers possessed sophisticated understanding of how seduction actually functions, how it operates through appeal to fundamental human needs and vulnerabilities, rather than through crude magical compulsion. The narratives suggest that the true power of the Silat lies not in any supernatural ability to control human will directly, but rather in their capacity to exploit the human condition itself, to weaponize the very desires and needs that render human existence meaningful. The preservation of Silat narratives within the 1001 Nights has had profound consequences for how these entities have been understood across centuries and across vast geographical distances. The written compilation of these stories, their translation into European languages during the 18th and 19th centuries, their subsequent influence on Western popular culture and literary traditions, has ensured that some knowledge of the Silat reaches beyond the specific cultural contexts in which they originated. Yet this process of cultural transmission also involved transformation and adaptation. The gradual abstraction of specifically Arab and Berber contexts into more universalized narratives of supernatural seduction. The Silat of the Nights are simultaneously absolutely rooted in their particular cultural moment and infinitely adaptable to new contexts. Their essential nature as seductive predators transcending the specific details of their presentation. There exists a fate worse than death at the hands of the Silat. A transformation so profound and so terrifying that many victims of possession regard it as the ultimate violation, worse than seduction, worse than the gradual draining of vital force, worse even than the physical death that might eventually follow. This fate is possession, the ability of the Silat to inhabit and control the bodies of their victims, to displace the victim's consciousness from his own flesh, and claim dominion over his physical form. Possession represents an obliteration of the self, far more complete than any weapon or force could accomplish. It transforms the victim into a prisoner in his own body, conscious but powerless, aware of his own actions, while being utterly incapable of controlling them. The psychological torment of possession exceeds what human consciousness is typically designed to endure, and yet victims of this violation have occasionally survived to describe the experience, leaving behind testimonies of a horror that transcends rational explanation. Understanding possession as practiced by the Silat requires examining both the mechanics of how these entities accomplish this violation and the profound psychological and spiritual consequences for those who endure it. The transition from seduction to possession does not occur instantaneously or without warning. Rather, it develops gradually as the Seelat's connection to her victim deepens through sustained energy extraction and psychological manipulation. In the early phases of their relationship, the Seeker maintains her victim's sense of autonomous agency even as she subtly works to dissolve his will and render him increasingly malleable to her influence. The victim experiences moments of what might be characterized as missing time, periods where his consciousness seems to have been interrupted and where he cannot account for his own actions. He finds himself having done things he does not remember deciding to do, having traveled to places he did not consciously choose to visit, having spoken words whose meanings he did not fully comprehend. These moments are typically brief and easily rationalized. The victim attributes them to exhaustion, to the disorientation of desert travel, to the psychological effects of his overwhelming emotional attachment to the Seelat. What is actually occurring during these episodes is the Seelat testing her access to her victim's body, gradually establishing the pathways through which she will eventually accomplish complete possession. The actual moment of full possession, the instant at which the Seelat completely displaces her victim's consciousness and assumes full control of his physical form, is often characterized in historical accounts as occurring during moments of extreme physical or emotional intensity. Many narratives describe possession happening during intimate encounters between the victim and the Seelat, moments when the victim's consciousness is already partially displaced by desire and pleasure. Other accounts suggest that possession can be deliberately induced by the Seelat through the recitation of specific words or the performance of particular gestures that bypass the victim's remaining rational defenses and force the issue of dominion. The moment of possession itself is frequently described as extraordinarily painful, as though the victim's consciousness is being forcibly ejected from his own body, as though his sense of self is being violently torn away and replaced with something fundamentally alien. The victim experiences a moment of absolute terror as he realizes what is happening, followed by a consciousness-numbing helplessness as he realizes that the body moving in the world is no longer under his control. Once possession has been accomplished, the victim enters into a state of consciousness that defies easy categorization or explanation. He remains aware, capable of sensation, able to perceive what his body is doing and where it is moving through the world. Yet, he possesses no control over these actions. He cannot move his limbs according to his will, cannot speak words of his choosing, cannot even direct his own attention toward things that matter to him. Instead, he experiences his body and its actions as though he were a passenger observing someone else operating the mechanism of flesh and bone that he inhabits. This experience generates a profound sense of violation and alienation, as though the most intimate and personal aspect of existence, the body, has been forcibly seized and repurposed for another's use. The victim cannot explain what is happening to him because he cannot control his own mouth to speak. He cannot cry out for help because his vocal cords respond only to the will of the Seelat. He is, quite literally, trapped within his own consciousness, aware and suffering, but utterly powerless. The psychological consequences of this violation manifest in numerous ways across the historical record. Victims of possession frequently report experiencing a dissolution of the boundary between self and other, a fundamental confusion regarding the nature of their own identity and agency. They struggle with the question of whether the actions their body performed during possession were actions they performed, whether they bear moral responsibility for things done through their body, but against their will. This philosophical and psychological uncertainty creates devastating psychological trauma. that can persist long after the possession itself has ended. Additionally, the experience of possession appears to create lasting vulnerabilities in the victim's consciousness, making them susceptible to future possession attempts by the same Silat, or potentially by other supernatural entities. Survivors of possession describe a permanent sense of alienation from their own bodies, a feeling that their flesh is no longer entirely their own, that some part of it has been irreversibly marked or claimed by the entity that violated it. During the period of possession, the Silat uses her victim's body for purposes that vary depending on her specific predatory needs and goals. In some cases, the possessed victim is simply moved from place to place as a form of supernatural transportation, the Silat using his body as a vehicle to travel distances more rapidly than she could accomplish in her own manifestation. In other instances, the possessed victim is used to prey upon other potential targets, his body and face serving as camouflage that allows the Silat to approach victims who might be suspicious of a lone woman, but who feel no threat toward what appears to be a traveling companion or local resident. Some narratives suggest that the Silat uses possession to feed more efficiently, forcing her victim's body to maintain contact with other targets, while she draws vital force from multiple sources simultaneously through the channels of connection established by possession. The most sinister accounts suggest that the Silat maintains possession for extended periods, using her victim's body for purposes that serve her long-term predatory strategies, reducing the victim to complete invisibility within his own life. The escape from possession is extraordinarily difficult and typically requires intervention from forces beyond the victim's individual capacity to summon. Religious scholars and spiritual practitioners across North Africa and the Islamic world developed elaborate techniques for casting out possessing spirits and reclaiming bodies that had been violated by supernatural entities. These techniques often involve the recitation of specific Quranic verses, the invocation of divine names, the performance of rituals designed to sever the spiritual connection between the Silat and her victim. The victim himself often cannot accomplish this liberation because his will remains imprisoned. The casting out of possession typically requires the intervention of someone with sufficient spiritual authority and power to challenge the Silat directly and force her to relinquish control of her victim's body. If the desert and the oasis represent the primary hunting grounds of the Silat, then a third category of location constitutes an equally crucial environment for their supernatural predation: the abandoned places, the spaces where human civilization has begun but failed to flourish, where structures have been erected and then forsaken, where the traces of human intention remain visible, yet the places themselves have been surrendered back to wilderness and decay. Crumbling fortresses overlooking empty trade routes, forgotten shrines that no pilgrims visit, caravanserais where merchants once gathered and conducted business, but which now stand empty and silent except for the wind and the creatures that inhabit darkness, dwellings where families once lived full lives, but which have been gradually abandoned as economic circumstances changed, or as supernatural dangers made habitation untenable. These are the places where the Silat gravitate with particular intensity. The abandoned place represents something far more sophisticated as a hunting ground than either the active oasis or the open desert, because it combines the isolation and psychological vulnerability of the wilderness with the psychological impact of human ruin, the site of failed civilization collapsing back into nature. The abandoned place speaks to something primal in human consciousness, something that recognizes in desolation a mirror of internal emptiness, a physical manifestation of spiritual despair. The relationship between the Silat and abandoned locations appears to be far more than merely opportunistic. It suggests instead a genuine affinity, a resonance between the nature of these creatures and the nature of the spaces they inhabit. The Silat are themselves creatures of abandonment in a sense, beings who exist in the margins of human civilization, who dwell in the spaces that humans have not successfully colonized or controlled. An abandoned place carries within it a spiritual quality that parallels their own existence. It is a location that has been cursed by failure, that has been marked by the inability of human will and intention to sustain continued habitation. Places possess their own forms of consciousness, according to Arab and Berber spiritual traditions. They accumulate the emotional resonance of events that occur within them. They retain memory. They develop character and personality. An abandoned location carries within it the accumulated despair of those who once inhabited it and then departed. The disappointment of unfulfilled hopes, the sense of human effort rendered meaningless by time and circumstance. The Silat appears to draw power from this accumulated despair, to feed upon the spiritual residue that permeates abandoned spaces with the same efficiency that she feeds upon the vital force of individual human victims. The specific types of abandoned places that attract the Silat most intensely possess certain consistent characteristics that appear across vast geographical distances and across centuries of historical documentation. Abandoned fortresses and military installations, structures built with the intention of projecting power and control, but which have become obsolete as political circumstances changed, serve as particularly powerful focal points for Silat activity. These locations carry within them the memory of violence, of military struggle, of human ambition to dominate and control through force, all of which creates a spiritual atmosphere heavy with residual psychological weight. Similarly, neglected shrines and religious sites that have lost their congregations and their spiritual vitality attract the Silat intensely, suggesting that these creatures possess a particular antithetical relationship to active faith and community spirituality. A shrine filled with pilgrims, resonant with prayer and devotion, appears to repel the Silat. A shrine abandoned by its congregation, its altars neglected, its sanctity compromised by time and disuse, becomes instead a beacon that draws them irresistibly. This pattern suggests that the Silat are fundamentally creatures of spiritual vacuum, that they thrive in environments where human faith and community connection have been extinguished or significantly diminished. The caravanserai represents perhaps the most distinctive category of abandoned location favored by the Silat. And understanding why these particular structures hold such attraction illuminates the broader predatory strategies of these entities. A caravanserai is inherently a liminal space, a structure designed specifically as a temporary way station where travelers pause briefly before continuing their journeys. The physical architecture of such buildings, with their central courtyards and peripheral rooms, their arrangement designed to facilitate transient population flows rather than permanent community establishment, creates an environment that discourages the formation of genuine social bonds. When a caravanserai falls into abandonment, it retains this quality of transience, this sense of being a space not truly belonging to anyone, not truly inhabited, but merely passed through. The Silat flourishes in such environments because the caravanserai's spatial architecture reinforces her predatory methodology. The abandoned caravanserai becomes a stage set designed perfectly for seduction and abandonment, a place where a victim might encounter a beautiful woman with the understanding that they are both merely temporary occupants of the same desolate structure. The physical deterioration that characterizes abandoned places contributes directly to their amplification of Silat power in ways that deserve careful examination. The breakdown of human-constructed order, the gradual return of wilderness to spaces that humans attempted to permanently domesticate, creates an environment where the boundary between civilization and wilderness becomes unstable and permeable. Walls crumble and allow sand to drift inward. Roofs collapse, and expose interiors to the elements. Vegetation begins to reclaim structures that humans built in defiance of nature. This process of decay mirrors and facilitates the process through which the Silat dissolves the psychological boundaries that normally protect human consciousness. Just as the abandoned structure has been breached and partially reclaimed by wilderness, the victim of the Silat experiences a gradual breaching and reclamation of his psychological boundaries, a progressive dissolution of the barriers that separate the self from the other. The abandoned place, with its visible evidence of human failure and nature's inevitable triumph, creates a psychological atmosphere that makes such dissolution seem not merely possible, but inevitable. Merely one example of a universal process of dissolution and decay. The darkness that accumulates within abandoned structures possesses qualities that exceed mere absence of light. In Islamic and pre-Islamic Arabian mystical understanding, certain types of darkness carry independent significance, representing spaces where divine light does not penetrate, or where the presence of evil powers concentrates with particular intensity. The interior chambers of abandoned fortresses, sealed from sunlight for years or decades, develop a quality of darkness that appears almost physical in its density and weight. Travelers and scholars who have ventured into such spaces frequently describe an oppressive quality to this darkness, a sense that light itself seems diminished and weakened in these environments, that conventional sources of illumination appear somehow ineffective. The Silat appears to draw power from such darkness, to manifest with greater clarity and intensity in environments where light has been thoroughly excluded. Some accounts suggest that the Silat can move more freely through absolute darkness, that her supernatural nature resonates with and is amplified by the absence of light that characterizes the deepest chambers of abandoned structures. For those who must travel through territories where the Silat hunt, for communities that have endured repeated encounters with these predatory entities across generations, the development of practical knowledge regarding identification becomes not merely an intellectual exercise, but a matter of survival. The Silat are masters of deception, their beauty a carefully maintained disguise that can withstand casual observation indefinitely. Yet this disguise possesses inherent weaknesses, specific points of vulnerability, where the truth of their nature can be glimpsed by those who know what to observe. The accumulated wisdom of centuries of encounter between Arab and Berber communities and these supernatural predators has produced a body of practical knowledge regarding the telltale signs that distinguish a Sitla from an ordinary human woman. Markers that can be identified through careful observation and disciplined skepticism. This knowledge represents survival itself, the difference between a man who travels through dangerous territories and returns intact, and a man who is seduced toward oblivion and never returns at all. The most obvious and most reliable method of identifying a Sila involves the direct observation of her feet, the one physical feature she most carefully conceals, yet which cannot be entirely disguised through clothing or behavioral maneuvering. The cloven hooves that mark her true nature possess characteristics that differ fundamentally from human feet in ways that become unmistakable upon direct examination. A human foot, no matter how calloused or weathered by travel, possesses 5 distinct toes and maintains the basic plantar architecture of human anatomy. The Silat's foot, by contrast, is divided into 2 sections at the main division between heel and toe area, forming a split hoof that cannot be mistaken for human anatomy once genuinely observed. The texture of the hoof differs dramatically from human skin. It possesses a hard, polished quality similar to animal hooves, and it demonstrates a coloration, typically dark brown or black, that stands in sharp contrast to the luminous quality of the rest of her skin. A careful observer who manages to witness a Sila's feet directly, particularly in situations where she has carelessly allowed her concealing garments to shift, or where water has soaked the hem of her clothing, will encounter unmistakable evidence of her non-human nature. Yet the direct observation of feet, while definitive, is extraordinarily difficult to accomplish because the sealet maintains extraordinary vigilance regarding this vulnerability. She wears garments specifically designed to conceal her feet from observation. She positions herself strategically to prevent accidental exposure. She actively manipulates circumstances to ensure that her feet remain hidden from potential observers. For this reason, travelers and communities developed alternative methods of identification that rely upon behavioral observation rather than direct physical inspection. One of the most consistently documented signs involves the sealat's relationship with salt, a substance that appears to carry particular significance in both Islamic and pre-Islamic, Middle Eastern and North African spirituality. The sealat possesses an aversion to consuming salt that approaches supernatural compulsion. She will refuse salt if offered, or she will attempt to consume it and experience visible distress. Some accounts suggest that consuming salt causes her physical pain, creating manifestations of discomfort that she cannot entirely conceal. This aversion extends beyond mere refusal to consume salt. It appears to affect her ability to remain in close proximity to salt, particularly salt that has been deliberately placed or invoked for protective purposes. The observation of shadow anomalies represents another significant method of identifying the sealat that has been documented across multiple sources and geographical regions. A human being casts a shadow that accurately corresponds to her physical form and that moves in synchronized relationship with her movements. The shadow of a sealer, by contrast, frequently manifests inconsistencies that careful observers can detect. The shadow may not match her physical form precisely. It may move slightly out of synchronization with her movements, or it may disappear entirely during certain hours or under specific light conditions. Some accounts suggest that at midday, when the sun stands directly overhead, a sealat casts no shadow whatsoever, a phenomenon that would appear utterly inexplicable to the uninformed observer, but which becomes a crucial identification marker for those who understand its significance. The detection of shadow anomalies requires particular observation and critical thinking, because the observer must distinguish between natural shadow variations caused by light angle and uneven terrain versus genuinely supernatural shadow disturbances that indicate the presence of a djinn. The refusal or inability to consume ordinary human food constitutes a third method of identification that operates through behavioral observation. The sealat, unlike human women, does not require conventional sustenance to maintain her physical form and capabilities. She feeds upon vital force extracted from her victims, not upon the food and water that sustain human metabolism. Consequently, when the sealer participates in the social rituals of meal consumption during moments of social interaction, she demonstrates subtle behavioral abnormalities that reveal this fundamental difference. She will eat very little, picking at food without genuine appetite, often appearing to place food in her mouth, but then somehow the food disappears without being swallowed. Her relationship with eating appears fundamentally different from human relationship with food. She engages in the ritual of eating without deriving genuine pleasure from it, treating the act as performance rather than as fulfillment of biological necessity. Observers who have lived around this behavior for extended periods describe a peculiar quality to how the sealat consumes: a lack of genuine engagement, a sense that she's merely simulating human feeding patterns. The observation of emotional responses and psychological affect provides yet another avenue through which the sealat's true nature can be detected. These creatures, while possessed of genuine intelligence and strategic thinking, do not experience human emotions with human intensity or human authenticity. Their displays of emotion often appear slightly performed, slightly exaggerated, as though they are executing an educated simulation of human feeling rather than experiencing emotion authentically. A careful observer may notice that the Silat's expressions of grief, joy, or affection contain something subtly off about them, something that registers in the consciousness as false, even when the observer cannot articulate precisely why the emotion appears inauthentic. Additionally, the Silat demonstrates callousness regarding suffering or harm in ways that reveal her fundamental alienness from human moral sensibility. She may express joy at witnessing human pain. She may display complete indifference to suffering that would disturb ordinary human consciousness. She may engage in cruelty with a casual unconcern that betrays her absolute otherness. The behavior of animals provides a final avenue of identification that has been documented consistently across historical accounts and folklore traditions. Animals possess sensitivities to supernatural presences that frequently exceed human perception. Horses become nervous and resistant to approaching the Silat. Dogs refuse her presence and respond with signs of distress. Birds flee when she approaches. These animal responses appear to occur regardless of the Silat's appearance or her behavioral performance of humanity, suggesting that animals perceive some essential quality of her nature that humans miss. A traveler who notices that his horse becomes inexplicably agitated and resistant to moving forward when approaching a beautiful woman, despite her apparent harmlessness, should treat this animal response as a crucial warning sign. The animal's fear or resistance operates as a kind of supernatural warning system, a mechanism through which the natural world alerts human beings to danger that exceeds ordinary sensory perception. Having established the nature of the Silat as predators of extraordinary sophistication and power, having examined the mechanisms through which they seduce and consume, we must now turn our attention to the equally sophisticated systems of protection that Arab and Berber communities developed across centuries of dangerous coexistence with these entities. These protective traditions represent not mere superstition or magical thinking divorced from rational understanding, but rather accumulated practical wisdom, tested survival strategies, refined through generations of experience with genuine supernatural threat. The communities of North Africa, the merchants traversing the desert trade routes, the settled peoples of oases and fortified cities, all recognized that the danger posed by the Silat was real and demanded systematic response. They developed comprehensive defensive frameworks encompassing ritual practice, material objects, behavioral disciplines, and spiritual invocations, all designed to create barriers between vulnerable human consciousness and the seductive power of these predatory entities. Understanding these protections illuminates not merely how to defend against the Silat, but reveals profound truths about how these cultures understood the nature of supernatural threat and the mechanisms through which spiritual defense could be constructed. The most fundamental protective principle developed across Arab and Berber traditions involves the creation of spiritual barriers through the recitation of sacred texts and invocations. The Quran itself, understood within Islamic tradition as the direct word of God preserved in human language, possesses inherent protective power against supernatural malevolence and demonic influence. Specific verses, particularly those that address the nature of the unseen realms and divine protection, came to be understood as possessing particular efficacy against entities like the Silat. The Ayat al-Kursi, the throne verse, which describes God's absolute knowledge and dominion over all creation, visible and invisible, became one of the most widely invoked protections against supernatural predation. Travelers would recite this verse before entering potentially dangerous territories. Merchants would invoke its protective power when settling down to sleep at oases, where Silat activity had been documented. Families would teach their children to recite these verses as a fundamental skill necessary for survival. The recitation of these sacred words operates not through crude, magical mechanism, but through the reinforcement of spiritual awareness and connection to divine protection, creating a psychological and spiritual state that renders the individual less vulnerable to seductive influence. Amulets and talismanic objects constitute a second major category of protection. Physical items crafted with the deliberate intention of warding off supernatural predation and anchoring the bearer to protective spiritual forces. The construction of such amulets typically involved collaboration between the individual seeking protection and religious scholars or spiritual practitioners recognized as possessing knowledge of supernatural dangers and the means to counter them. These amulets frequently incorporated written verses from the Quran, divine names invoked for protection, and specific symbols understood within Islamic and pre-Islamic Arabian traditions as carrying apotropaic power. The amulets might be crafted from various materials: leather, metal, cloth, wood, each material selected for specific reasons related to its symbolic associations or its reputed spiritual properties. An amulet might be worn suspended from the neck, carried in a pouch, or sewn into the hem of clothing, where it could provide continuous protection without drawing obvious attention. The effectiveness of such amulets appears to have derived partly from their material presence, providing a tangible reminder of protective intention, and partly from the spiritual intention invested in their creation and the faith of those who wore them. Salt emerges across multiple sources and traditions as perhaps the most universally significant protective substance in the Arab and Berber defensive arsenal against the Sialat. Salt possesses multiple layers of significance in Islamic and pre-Islamic Middle Eastern spirituality, functioning simultaneously as a purifying agent, as a symbol of covenant and binding agreement, and as a substance hostile to supernatural malevolence and demonic influence. The placement of salt barriers around sleeping areas, the consumption of salt before vulnerable moments, the practice of throwing salt in specific patterns when supernatural danger was sensed, all emerged as practical protective techniques. Communities developed particular practices involving salt that became embedded in daily behavioral routines. Mothers would ensure that children consumed salt before traveling. Merchants would place salt in precise patterns around their encampments at night. Families would maintain supplies of salt specifically designated for protective rather than culinary purposes. The hostility that the Silat demonstrates towards salt, her visible discomfort when exposed to it, her apparent inability to cross salt barriers that have been ritually invoked, suggests that this substance carries genuine supernatural significance in the interaction between human and Djinn realms. Iron and steel constitute a third category of protective material, substances understood as possessing inherent power to repel supernatural entities and create barriers against demonic influence. In Islamic tradition, iron is associated with strength, with divine power, and with the ability to constrain and bind supernatural forces, appearing in the Quranic account of the Prophet Solomon's use of molten copper to construct barriers against the forces of chaos. The deliberate possession of iron objects, the wearing of iron jewelry, the construction of iron implements and talismans all emerged as protective strategies against the Sila. A merchant traveling through dangerous territories might deliberately equip himself with iron tools and weapons, not merely for practical purposes, but for their protective, spiritual significance. Families would maintain iron objects of specific significance: a nail from an ancient sanctuary, an iron ring inscribed with protective formulas, iron bracelets worn for both aesthetic and protective purposes. The effectiveness of iron protection appears to operate similarly to salt protection. The Silat demonstrates visible difficulty in approaching or maintaining contact with iron objects, suggesting genuine supernatural aversion to this material. Behavioral discipline and lifestyle practices constitute a fourth protective framework that emerges consistently across the historical record and oral traditions. The communities most successful in resisting Silat predation developed specific behavioral protocols designed to reduce vulnerability to seduction and manipulation. These protocols involved maintaining strong community bonds and social accountability, ensuring that individuals were never completely isolated or entirely dependent upon their own judgment. A man traveling through dangerous territories was instructed to maintain relationships with established community members at waypoints and settlements, to seek out settings with multiple witnesses rather than isolated encounters, to maintain skepticism regarding unexpected encounters with beautiful women in wilderness settings. Religious practice itself, particularly the maintenance of regular prayer, ritual observance, and spiritual discipline, was understood as providing protection not merely through theological significance, but through the development of psychological resilience and critical awareness. The individual who maintained regular spiritual practice appeared to develop greater resistance to the psychological manipulation through which the Silat operates, as though the discipline of regular spiritual practice created neural and psychological pathways that made the individual more resistant to seduction and disorientation. The Silat are not unique among world folklore as predatory entities who seduce and consume human victims through supernatural means. European traditions, developed in isolation from Arab and Berber cultures, yet emerging from similarly ancient human attempts to understand and categorize supernatural threat, produced their own category of seductive demonic entities. The succubi, female demons who engaged in sexual seduction of human men and who drew sustenance from their victims' vital essence. At first glance, the Silat and the succubus appear to occupy remarkably similar positions within their respective cultural cosmologies. Both are fundamentally feminine entities. Both operate through seduction as their primary predatory mechanism. Both extract vital force from their human victims. Both exist in states of permanent alienation from human civilization and community. The similarities are striking enough that scholars examining folklore traditions from a comparative perspective have sometimes treated the Silat and the succubus as variations of a universal archetype, as though all cultures independently arrived at the same fundamental understanding of what seductive, supernatural predation looks like. Yet beneath these surface similarities lies a profound gulf of cultural difference, theological distinction, and divergent understanding of the nature of supernatural danger itself. The theological context surrounding the European succubus emerges directly from Christian cosmology and the particular way that medieval Christian thought categorized supernatural entities and moral danger. Within the Christian framework, the succubus functions as a manifestation of demonic power, a being created by Satan or operating under his direct command, an instrument through which evil attempts to corrupt human souls and draw them towards spiritual destruction. The succubus exists within a fundamentally binary moral cosmology in which all supernatural entities are classified as either divine or demonic, either aligned with God or aligned with Satan. The succubus represents unambiguous evil. There is no moral complexity in her nature, no suggestion that she might possess motivations or intelligences that operate outside the framework of good and evil as understood within Christian theology. The Christian tradition interpreted the succubus's seduction of men not merely as physical predation, but as spiritual warfare, as an attempt to corrupt the soul and draw the victim away from Christian faith and divine salvation. In contrast, the Silat exists within an Islamic and pre-Islamic Arabian spiritual framework that does not necessarily classify all supernatural entities into simple binaries of good and evil. The Selat is neither the instrument of Satan nor the servant of any opposing force. She is an autonomous entity operating according to her own nature and motivations, responding to drives that exceed the comprehension of human moral categories. The physical appearance of the succubus in European folklore differs significantly from the Selat in ways that reflect distinct cultural attitudes toward the body and sexuality. The European succubus is typically described as a creature whose beauty, while certainly seductive, often contains elements of the grotesque or the obviously non-human. Medieval Christian sources frequently described succubi as possessing animal characteristics: bat wings, cloven hooves similar to those of goats or demons, tails, horns, physical markers that immediately advertise their demonic nature and supernatural origin. The succubus's appeal derives partly from forbidden transgression, from the seduction itself being obviously demonic and therefore sinful. Her non-human appearance functions as an explicit warning that sexual engagement with this entity represents a violation of Christian morality. The Selat, by contrast, presents herself as perfection within the boundaries of human aesthetic possibility. Her beauty exceeding human standards, but remaining comprehensible within human categories of attractiveness. Her non-human nature remains entirely concealed. Her animal characteristics are hidden rather than displayed, her danger remaining invisible until the moment of revelation. This difference reflects distinct cultural attitudes. Christian European culture emphasized the visibility of evil, the importance of recognizing and fleeing obvious demonic markers. Arab and Berber cultures emphasized the danger of invisibility, the reality that the most deadly predators are those whose true nature remains concealed. The method through which succubi and Selat extract vital force differs in ways that illuminate distinct understandings of how human existence is structured and what aspects of human vitality constitute viable targets for supernatural predation. The European succubus, within Christian theological frameworks, feeds specifically upon sexual energy and the spiritual corruption that results from sexual transgression. The sin of the act itself, the violation of Christian sexual morality, constitutes the means through which the succubus draws power, the seduction functioning both as predatory mechanism and as corruption of the victim's soul. The succubus's feeding is inextricably linked to moral transgression. She gains power through the victim's willing participation in acts understood as sinful within Christian framework. The Selat, operating within a different theological and spiritual context, feeds upon vital force itself, the fundamental energy that animates human existence, regardless of whether that extraction occurs within morally transgressive circumstances. The Selat does not require her victim's spiritual degradation or moral corruption to accomplish her predation. She requires only his psychological vulnerability and his willingness to engage with her seductively. This difference reflects distinct understandings of how human spiritual integrity is structured. Christian theology emphasizes moral transgression as the primary vulnerability. Islamic and pre-Islamic Arabian tradition emphasizes psychological vulnerability and isolation from community spiritual support. The relationship between succubi and demonic authority versus the independence of the Selat constitutes another crucial area of divergence. The European succubus operates within a hierarchical demonology in which demonic entities serve under the command of Satan and operate according to demonic authority structures. The succubus may have individual agency and individual preferences, but she ultimately functions as an agent of satanic power, as a participant in cosmic warfare between divine and demonic forces. The Selat, by contrast, appears to operate with genuine autonomy and independence, answerable to no higher authority or demonic hierarchy, responding only to her own nature and drives. She is not an agent of any cosmic force opposing Islam or opposing divine order. She is an autonomous predator whose existence and predatory behavior represent not moral or spiritual transgression, but rather the natural operation of supernatural entities according to their own nature and constitution. This distinction reflects profoundly different cosmologies. Christian thought emphasizes cosmic warfare between good and evil, divine and demonic. Islamic tradition emphasizes divine sovereignty extended over all creation, with even supernatural entities operating within parameters established by divine will rather than in opposition to it. The cultural memory and persistence of these entities in their respective traditions reveals distinct patterns regarding how communities maintain protective knowledge across generations. The European succubus, existing within Christian theological frameworks that position the Church as the primary authority on supernatural matters, became increasingly abstracted and literary, incorporated into theological texts and theological speculation rather than maintained as practical survival knowledge. The succubus gradually transitioned from a genuine supernatural danger that communities needed to defend against into a literary and theological concept, a figure that appeared in theological texts and religious commentaries, but that became progressively more distant from practical community experience. The sealat, by contrast, has maintained a stronger connection to practical community knowledge and lived experience. The dangers she represents remain understood as genuine, contemporary threats, requiring ongoing vigilance and protective practice, rather than as historical curiosities or theological abstractions. The sealat cannot be adequately understood through the lens of European supernatural traditions, nor can they be reduced to universal archetypes of seductive predation that transcend cultural specificity. Rather, the sealat embodies a distinctly Arab and Berber understanding of gender, power, desire, and supernatural danger, one that emerges from the specific geographical, theological, and cultural context of North Africa and the Arab world. To grasp the full significance of these entities and the reasons they persist so powerfully in cultural consciousness, despite centuries of modernization and social change, one must examine how the sealat reflects unique cultural anxieties and cultural wisdom that have no direct equivalent in other folkloric traditions. The sealat is not a variant of the succubus or a local adaptation of a universal demon type. She is a uniquely Arab and Berber creation, reflecting the particular vulnerabilities and particular forms of danger that characterize the worlds in which Arab and Berber peoples lived and struggled to survive. Understanding this cultural specificity requires moving beyond comparative folklore scholarship and entering into a deeper engagement with the particular context from which the sealat emerged. The relationship between gender and power within Arab and Berber cultural traditions differs fundamentally from the gender dynamics embedded within European Christian traditions, and these differences shape how seductive supernatural predation is understood and conceptualized. In European Christian tradition, particularly as developed through medieval theology, women occupy a specific position. They are understood as inherently more vulnerable to demonic temptation than men, more susceptible to sexual transgression, more spiritually fragile. The succubus thus functions within a theological framework that emphasizes the weakness and sinfulness of masculinity in the face of feminine sexual power. She seduces men by exploiting supposed masculine weakness regarding sexual desire. The sealat, by contrast, operates within a cultural context where female power is understood not as weakness or moral danger, but as a form of autonomous supernatural agency. She's not a victim of demonic control expressing herself through seduction. She is an independent predator exercising her own will and pursuing her own sustenance. This distinction reflects a fundamentally different understanding of female agency. European Christian tradition emphasizes the woman as vessel through which demonic power operates. Arab and Berber tradition presents the Selat as agent in her own right, responsible for her own predation, autonomous and intelligent rather than victimized or controlled. The desert environment itself, as a defining context for Selat mythology, reflects the particular geographical and material conditions of Arab and Berber existence. The European supernatural tradition developed primarily in contexts of agricultural civilization, settled communities, structured feudalism, and urban development. The demon and the succubus emerge from European encounters with supernatural danger within these specific civilizational contexts. The Arab and Berber tradition developed within the context of desert travel, nomadic pastoralism, the existence of vast uninhabited territories, and the specific vulnerabilities created by isolation and environmental hostility. The Selat emerges from and remains bound to this desert context. She is not merely placed in the desert, but is fundamentally a creature of the desert, drawing power from that environment, reflecting the particular dangers of that world. The danger she represents is not the danger of demonic corruption within Christian civilization, but the danger of supernatural predation at the boundaries of civilization, in the spaces where human communities have not yet established complete dominion. This geographical difference generates entirely different conceptualizations of supernatural threat. European tradition emphasizes the demon within civilization, the corruption of Christendom from within. Arab and Berber tradition emphasizes the supernatural predator of the margins, the danger lurking in the spaces where civilization ends. The Islamic theological context provides another layer of cultural specificity that differentiates the Selat from European supernatural entities. Within Islamic tradition, Djinn are understood not as demons, but as autonomous supernatural beings created from smokeless fire, existing in their own realms alongside human civilization, but operating according to their own nature and will. The Quran explicitly acknowledges the existence of Djinn and describes them as beings with intelligence, will, and moral capacity, some righteous, some transgressive, but fundamentally different from the European concept of demons as servants of evil. The Selat exists within this Islamic theological framework as a type of Djinn, an autonomous supernatural being whose predatory behavior reflects her own nature rather than representing a manifestation of satanic power. This theological difference is profound. It means that the Selat is not fighting against divine order, but is instead operating as part of divine creation, exercising the will and agency that Allah has granted to Djinn according to Islamic understanding. The danger she represents is not moral or theological transgression, but rather the natural operation of a supernatural being according to her own constitution. Danger that is genuine and deadly, yet not framed within the moral binary of good and evil that characterizes European Christian understanding. The cultural understanding of seduction itself differs fundamentally between Arab and Berber traditions and European Christian traditions in ways that shape how seductive supernatural predation is conceptualized. European Christian tradition, particularly as developed through the witch hunts and the theology of sexual transgression, emphasizes seduction as moral corruption, as the violation of Christian sexual ethics, as the dragging of the victim into sin. The seduction is thus primarily a spiritual and moral phenomenon. Its danger lies in the way it leads the victim toward damnation and spiritual destruction. Arab and Berber tradition, by contrast, emphasizes seduction as psychological manipulation and energy extraction. The danger lies not primarily in moral transgression, but in the victim's progressive depletion and the predator's feeding upon his vital force. The Selat seduction operates not through temptation towards sin, but through exploitation of human vulnerability, through the weaponization of desire itself, through progressive psychological dissolution. This difference reflects distinct understandings of what constitutes the core of human danger in the face of supernatural predation. European tradition emphasizes moral and spiritual peril. Arab and Berber tradition emphasizes psychological vulnerability and energetic depletion. The persistence of the seelat in contemporary Arab and North African consciousness reflects the ongoing relevance of these culturally specific understandings of gender, power, desire, and supernatural danger. Modern Arab and Berber peoples continue to reference the seelat in cultural production, in literature and film, in contemporary discussions of supernatural danger and psychological vulnerability. This ongoing engagement with the seelat suggests that the figure continues to resonate not merely as historical curiosity, but as a meaningful framework for understanding contemporary realities, the dangers of isolation, the vulnerability of individual psychology to manipulation, the reality of predatory intelligence operating in the margins of civilization. The seelat persists because she speaks to truths about the human condition that remain perpetually relevant, truths understood through specifically Arab and Berber cultural lenses, yet possessing universal human significance. The 21st century presents a paradox regarding the persistence of the seelat within contemporary Arab and North African consciousness. In an age of global communication, scientific advancement, and the apparent triumph of rational materialism over traditional spiritual understanding, one might reasonably expect the legend of the seelat to fade into historical obscurity, relegated to the status of quaint folklore, interesting primarily to anthropologists and folklore scholars. Yet, the evidence suggests the opposite. The seelat continues to exercise genuine psychological and cultural influence across Arab and North African societies, appearing not merely in nostalgic retellings of ancient stories, but in contemporary testimonies, in modern media, in the lived experience of people navigating the complexities of contemporary existence. This persistence of ancient mythology in the face of modernization is not unique to the seelat. Yet, the specific forms that persistence takes, the particular context in which the seelat appears in contemporary consciousness, reveals something profound about how traditional cultures maintain connection to ancestral wisdom even as they navigate the transformations of modernity. Contemporary accounts of seelat encounters, while varying in specific details, maintain remarkable consistency with historical and traditional descriptions. Modern testimonies from across North Africa and the Arab world describe experiences that parallel classical accounts. Encounters with extraordinarily beautiful women in isolated settings, progressive psychological dissolution following intimate contact, the victim's inability to break free from attachment, despite rational recognition of danger, physical and psychological symptoms consistent with vital force depletion. These modern testimonies are not presented as historical curiosities or mythological references. They are offered as genuine experiences, as events that the testifiers experienced directly or heard about from trustworthy sources. Urban legends and contemporary folklore traditions maintain the seelat as an active threat, something that could reasonably be encountered in contemporary settings, rather than treating her as purely historical phenomenon. The persistence of such testimonies across centuries and across vast geographical distances, their consistency despite the modernization and transformation of Arab and North African societies, suggests that the seelat represents something more fundamental than merely a historical artifact or cultural memory. The psychological and spiritual vulnerabilities that the seelat exploits, isolation, loneliness, the hunger for intimate connection, the desperation of individuals separated from community support structures, have not diminished in the modern world, but have instead intensified and proliferated. Modern urbanization, while providing material benefits and opportunities, frequently isolates individuals from the traditional community bonds and spiritual support systems that characterized earlier forms of social organization. The migrant worker separated from his family, the urban dweller living in isolation amid masses of humanity, the individual disconnected from religious practice and community ritual, all possess psychological profiles identical to those of classical Sealat victims. All harbor vulnerabilities identical to those that the Sealat has exploited throughout history. The contemporary world, with its emphasis on individual autonomy and its fragmentation of traditional community bonds, may have actually created conditions more favorable to Sealat predation than existed in earlier historical periods. The proliferation of communication technologies and the rise of virtual interaction, while creating new forms of connection, have simultaneously deepened certain forms of psychological isolation and created new avenues through which manipulation and seduction can operate. The rise of contemporary media and the reinterpretation of the Sealat through modern artistic and literary expression has generated new contexts through which these entities remain visible within Arab and North African cultural consciousness. Contemporary Arab cinema, literature, and visual arts continue to engage with Sealat mythology, creating modern retellings that situate these entities within contemporary contexts while maintaining fidelity to their fundamental predatory nature. These artistic engagements are not mere nostalgic exercises. They function as ongoing cultural negotiations with ancient mythology, attempts to maintain relevance and meaning within contemporary cultural frameworks. The Sealat appears in contemporary fiction not as a historical curiosity, but as a figure capable of representing contemporary forms of predation and psychological danger. A modern novelist or filmmaker drawing upon Sealat mythology is not merely preserving tradition. They are creating new frameworks through which contemporary audiences can understand contemporary dangers, using ancient mythological language to articulate modern experiences of vulnerability and manipulation. The relationship between the Sealat and modern Islamic revivalism and spiritual renewal movements deserves particular attention. In understanding how ancient mythology maintains contemporary relevance, as certain sectors of Arab and North African society have engaged in conscious reassessment and recommitment to Islamic tradition and practice, the Sealat has resurged in cultural prominence as a figure through which spiritual dangers and the necessity of spiritual discipline can be articulated. The Sealat functions within these movements not as mere folkloric curiosity, but as a warning figure, a symbol of the dangers posed by spiritual complacency and disconnection from religious practice. Religious scholars engaging contemporary audiences through media and educational platforms reference the Sealat as an example of supernatural danger that remains relevant in the contemporary world, as evidence that the Islamic tradition's understanding of the unseen realms and of supernatural predation retains accuracy and applicability. This appropriation of Sealat mythology within contemporary Islamic discourse functions to reinforce spiritual discipline and religious practice, while simultaneously maintaining the relevance of traditional folklore knowledge. The persistence of protective practices and spiritual disciplines related to Sealat defense in contemporary Arab and North African communities further evidences the living status of this mythology within modern consciousness. While the specific forms of protection have evolved to accommodate modern contexts, the fundamental practices, the recitation of Quranic verses, the maintenance of spiritual discipline, the cultivation of community connection and social accountability, continue to be taught and practiced as genuine protective measures against supernatural predation. Parents continue to warn children about the dangers posed by supernatural seduction. Teachers incorporate protective spiritual knowledge into educational contexts. communities continue to develop narratives and practices designed to defend vulnerable individuals. This ongoing transmission of protective knowledge across generations suggests that the sealat is not understood merely as historical phenomenon, but as continuing present danger, requiring ongoing vigilance and defensive preparation. The digital age presents new and unprecedented contexts through which the sealat mythology has begun to manifest and transform. Online communities, social media platforms, and virtual spaces populated by Arab and North African diaspora communities continue to generate and circulate sealat narratives, creating new folklore that integrates contemporary technology and contemporary social dynamics into ancient mythological frameworks. The beautiful woman encountered through social media, the development of intense connection through digital communication, followed by progressive psychological depletion, the emergence of predatory intelligence operating through technological interfaces, all represent modern translations of classical sealat predation. These contemporary narratives suggest that communities are actively working to integrate ancient wisdom regarding supernatural predation into new technological and social contexts, maintaining the relevance of traditional mythology by applying it to new forms of danger. We have journeyed together through the landscape of sealat mythology, examining the nature of these seductive predators with the precision and rigor they deserve, tracing the mechanisms through which they operate and the cultural contexts that gave them form and meaning. From their extraordinary beauty to their hidden hooves, from the deserts and oases where they hunt to the abandoned structures where they concentrate their power, from the sophisticated seduction strategies through which they manipulate their victims, to the protective practices through which communities defend themselves. We have constructed a comprehensive understanding of these entities and their significance. Yet, as we approach the end of our exploration, we must step back and consider a deeper question that transcends the specific details of sealat predation. What fundamental truths about human existence do these creatures illuminate, and why do they persist so powerfully in the collective consciousness of cultures separated by centuries and vast geographical distances? The answer to this question lies not in any supernatural mechanism or in any particular predatory technique, but rather in the sealat's function as a mirror reflecting back to us our own deepest vulnerabilities and our own most fundamental desires. The sealat represents, at the most fundamental level, the human terror of being unmade by attraction, the knowledge that the very capacities that render human life meaningful and worthwhile, the ability to love, to connect, to open oneself to another being, simultaneously create vulnerabilities to predation and destruction. The beautiful woman who seduces is not merely a dangerous entity. She is a dangerous entity precisely because human beings possess the capacity to love and to desire, precisely because connection and intimacy are recognized as essential goods worth pursuing, despite the risks they entail. The sealat exploits this fundamental condition of human existence. She weaponizes the very desires that drive human community formation and intimate bonding. To encounter the sealat is to confront the reality that the highest goods, love, connection, intimate knowledge of another being, carry within them the seeds of destruction. That there exists no method to pursue these goods that eliminates entirely the possibility of encountering predatory intelligence operating under the guise of beloved. The persistence of sealat mythology across centuries suggests that human consciousness has never achieved closure on this fundamental anxiety. Each generation must confront anew the reality that desire carries danger within it. The sealat also functions as a profound expression of cultural wisdom regarding the nature of psychological vulnerability and the mechanisms through which predatory intelligence operates. the detailed attention paid to the Sealat's seduction strategies, to the specific psychological states that render victims susceptible to her influence, to the progressive dissolution of rational resistance that occurs through her systematic manipulation, represents accumulated understanding of how human psychology actually functions. The Sealat's tactics are not crude or obvious. They exploit genuine human vulnerabilities, genuine psychological mechanisms that operate in human consciousness regardless of whether one consciously recognizes them operating. The culture that created and maintained Sealat mythology was simultaneously creating a comprehensive manual for understanding how predatory intelligence works, how it identifies and exploits vulnerability, how it constructs elaborate psychological traps. The Sealat mythology is therefore not merely entertainment or supernatural storytelling. It is a sophisticated framework for psychological education, a method through which cultures transmitted understanding of danger and manipulation to subsequent generations. The persistence of this mythology suggests that these psychological truths remain perpetually relevant, that each generation must learn anew how vulnerability operates and how predatory intelligence exploits it. The Sealat also crystallizes a distinctly Arab and Berber understanding of gender, power, and agency that deserves recognition as a sophisticated philosophical position regarding the nature of feminine power and masculine vulnerability. The Sealat is not a victim of demonic control, not a creature forced to predation against her will, but rather an autonomous being exercising her own will and pursuing her own sustenance. She possesses intelligence, intentionality, and complete autonomy. She's responsible for her own predation in ways that the European succubus is not. This representation of feminine agency and power, combined with the recognition that this power operates through seduction and psychological manipulation rather than through crude force, expresses a particular cultural truth regarding how power actually operates in human societies. The Sealat is a figure through which Arab and Berber cultures explored the reality that some of the most dangerous forms of power operate through subtlety and psychological sophistication rather than through obvious force, and that recognizing such power requires sustained vigilance and critical awareness. The Sealat teaches that genuine threat does not always announce itself obviously. It often approaches wearing the face of what we most desire. The mythology of the Sealat ultimately teaches a lesson about the necessity of maintaining awareness and discipline in the face of our own vulnerabilities. The protective practices developed across Arab and Berber traditions, the recitation of sacred texts, the wearing of amulets, the consumption of salt, the maintenance of spiritual discipline and community connection, all share a common theme. They require conscious effort, sustained practice, and deliberate maintenance. There is no single magical shield that permanently protects against the Sealat. Rather, protection requires ongoing vigilance, repeated practice, and sustained commitment to spiritual and psychological discipline. This teaches a profound truth: the defense against predatory forces, whether supernatural or otherwise, requires not a single dramatic action, but rather a sustained commitment to practices that maintain awareness, connection, and psychological resilience. The Sealat mythology thus functions as a teaching regarding the necessity of discipline and the dangers of complacency, reminding each generation that safety requires active maintenance rather than passive assumption. As we conclude this exploration of the Sealat and their significance within Arab and Berber folklore, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to you for joining us through this journey into the darker territories of world mythology. If this investigation into these seductive and terrifying entities has resonated with you, if you have found value in examining how cultures understand supernatural predation and psychological vulnerability, I encourage you to continue this exploration by subscribing to Echoes of the Old World. Our channel exists to illuminate the profound wisdom embedded within cultural traditions around the world, to demonstrate that mythology is not merely entertainment, but a sophisticated framework through which cultures articulate truth about human existence and supernatural reality. Your subscription ensures that we can continue bringing you deeply researched narratives that challenge, educate, and inspire contemplation regarding the rich heritage of human culture. The veil between worlds remains thin in these stories, and there is much more terrain to explore together. Thank you for bearing witness to the Sealat, for allowing these ancient entities to speak to your consciousness, and for recognizing that in understanding the monsters of our ancestors' nightmares, we understand something fundamental about ourselves. The Sealat endure because the truths they embody endure, and so long as human beings continue to love and to desire, to seek connection and to risk vulnerability, these seductive predators of the desert will continue to haunt our collective consciousness.